You're listening to the Culture Connection Podcast. Here's your host, Giancarlo Nadeau.
Welcome back to the show. You are listening to the Cultural Connection Podcast. I'm your host, Giancarlo Nadeau. The first episode was all about recognizing the issues that exist within this province, within our great province of British Columbia. And we had the opportunity to speak with an Indigenous person named Candy, hear her stories, her past memories of what it was like being Indigenous growing up, as well as the issues, challenges, and problems that she continues to face today. Certainly some heavy stuff, and it's not going to get any lighter in this second episode. We focus and put our attention towards residential schools. We bring Candy back into this episode, and she shares her stories of the residential school system in this province based on what she has heard from her family members. The last residential school did not close its doors until 1996, but many issues that arose during the years that residential schools were operating, they still continue to this very day. Many of the leaders, teachers, parents, and grandparents of today's Indigenous communities are residential school survivors and continue to feel the intergenerational effects of transmitted personal trauma and loss of language, culture, traditional teachings, and mental and spiritual well-being. It is difficult for those not closely impacted by the effects of residential schools to comprehend the severity and significant impacts that were caused. Many residents in BC are certainly getting to the point now where they're starting to hear these stories, which is great, and that's also what this episode is trying to provide and trying to offer you, a chance to hear some more stories. I do just want to warn you that the following content contains material that may be harmful or traumatizing to some audiences. And I do just want to give you a heads up, just give you a warning that some of the stories, some of the things she does talk about is not suitable for everybody to listen to.
Actually went to residential school just for a year and a half. My grandfather, her dad, he went to residential school, one of the worst in Saskatchewan, St. Philip's, and he had him and his siblings had a horrible time. They were scooped up when they were little babies, like about 4 or 5 years old, taken to the school. They had no choice. Their parents had no choice but to let them go. And they had their hair cut off. And in Indigenous cultures, well, Canadian Indigenous cultures, your hair is very significant, right? It means it ties to your family, your community, your spiritual well-being. And they cut off their hair. My paternal grandfather's sister, my Coco Agnes, Coco means grandmother in Soto, she was telling me when I was 16 years old, and she started to cry, that they took her away from her parents, and they threatened to cut off her tongue if she spoke in her Indigenous language. And she was 5 years old. She did not speak a lick of English, so it took her a number of years.
Rights are often taken for granted by many citizens in Canada, but for a significant amount of time, rights were stripped and taken away from Indigenous people.
When my grandparents had children, he specifically said, my kids are not going to residential school. My mom was always loved education. She just loved it since she was a small child. And she convinced, because my grandfather would go off the reserve to work, because at that time you needed permission to leave the reserve to work. And so he would be gone for long periods of time. And my mom convinced my grandmother to let her to go to residential school because she thought it was education. So she let her go because my mom was really stubborn and headstrong, just like I am. And she went for about a year and a half. My mom was physically abused. And it was this school in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, northwestern Saskatchewan. And she was physically abused, but she also witnessed a lot of sexual abuse from the nuns to her peers, like young girls, like 10, 12, 13 years old, the nuns would come in and take them and abuse them at nighttime. And the priests also abused both the young girls and the young boys.
There were over 130 residential schools operating in Canada between 1831 and 1996. In 1931, there were 80 residential schools open in Canada. That was the most at any one time. By learning about Indigenous people, their culture, and the issues surrounding them, I am choosing to educate myself on the importance that they have in our country. From the stories that I have watched, the films that I have seen, the books and novels that I have read, and this podcast that I have worked on, I have started to open my eyes much further into the harsh realities of this history. The Indigenous people that I have met are usually willing to talk about their dark history in hopes of educating people like myself on their past. How the Canadian government and citizens of Canada treated Indigenous people is very unfortunate and very upsetting to hear. Some events are very dark and cause me to become very emotional. No one should ever be treated as poorly as they were.
I never went to residential school. My older sibling did. She went for 6 months and she experienced a lot of physical violence. But my mom, she went for like a year and a half, and after that, like, she just went to a regular school after that when my grandfather found out. So she let my sister go for 6 months, but we were not ever allowed to go. I have a lot of cousins who went. When they were small, they were all shipped off to residential schools. They were told by the priests when they were little boys, like honestly, like 4 or 5 years old, do you want to come and see God's milk? Do you want to experience God's milk? And in fact, what it was the priests sexually assaulting these little boys. And their semen was called they referred to God's milk.
On May 27th, 2021, the Southern BC First Nations leadership announced that 215 unmarked and previously undocumented grave sites had been found using ground-penetrating radar at the site of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. The remains were described as belonging to children as young as 3. This is a long process that will take significant time and resources. They were children, robbed of their families and their childhood. We need to now give them the dignity that they never had. Those are our next steps. Those were the words of Sarah Beaulieu, who performed the search just days before the preliminary results were made public. I live in North Vancouver, and only a few minutes away is a high school, a private high school that used to be a residential school. I never knew that. My friends that attended that school never knew much about it until these graves were discovered and the news really started to bring it to the forefront of their attention. They had a statue at the school, but nobody ever talked about it. Nobody knew that that was a former residential school, and there's schools like that all over the country that were residential schools that not many people know about. When you take a walk, sometimes you will find orange shirts lined up along school fences or shoes at grave sites or at schools. And just remember that this all has to do with residential schools.
I've had my mom would tell us stories like how she would have friends that would just disappear, and the priests and nuns would tell them that they were sent home, but when in fact they were just gone. These were my experiences, right? Of course, everyone has a different experience.
In September 2007, while the settlement agreement was being put into action, the Canadian government made a motion to issue a formal apology for all of the lost Indigenous children who never came home from residential schools. You will never be forgotten. My name's Giancarlo Nadeau. That's your Cultural Connection podcast on the Evolution Podcast Network.